This picturesque procession of buildings on Thomas Street is one of the great streetscapes of Providence or of Rhode Island or of New England. All of these four buildings have an interesting story, and particularly the one in the center, the Seril Dodge House. It starts with a silversmith and metalsmith named Seril Dodge, who moved to Providence from Pomfret, Connecticut in the 1770s and set up shop on what we now call Main Street, but in the colonial period was called Town Street. At the foot of Thomas Street was a neighborhood then called Cheapside, the name being borrowed from the London neighborhood of the same character, a neighborhood of small craftsmen, people who made things out of wood and pottery and metalsmiths. Seril Dodge was trained as a silversmith, and so moved here and started making silver and engraving brass. And by 1786 began to build a house across the street from the great Baptist church. This engraving from Massachusetts Magazine of August 1789 was the very first picture ever published of a scene in Providence. And here we see the spectacular Baptist meeting house built in 1774 and 75, largely with the impetus of the Brown brothers, a great mercantile firm in Providence. It was built on land purchased from the family of Thomas Angel, whose family had settled this area on the hillside and whose land the Brown family had bought so that they could build this church and develop the surrounding neighborhood. Across the street, we're going to zoom in a little here and see a house that is almost lost against the majesty of this great meeting house, the most spectacular building of its time in Providence. And this was the house built by Seril Dodge around 1786. Here's an example of his engraving on a brass clock face, which is silvered. This clock is in the collection of the Rhode Island Historical Society. Seril Dodge lived in this house until 1791, when he built the house next door, the brick house you see on the right in the photograph. And by 1796, he'd had enough of living in Providence and put it up for sale. So here we see Seril selling his second house, a handsome brick dwelling house, 3 stories high, completely finished and only 4 years old, situated in the central part of town opposite the Baptist meeting house. So goodbye, Seril Dodge, who moves back to Pomfret. Now, Nicholas Brown I had a mansion house, no longer standing, but it's about where the Crawford Street Bridge is, crosses the river on South Main Street. Nicholas Brown died in 1791, and Avis Brown was the widow of Nicholas Brown. And as we see in this sketch of her gravestone, it says that she was the second wife of Nicholas Brown Esquire and the daughter of Captain Barnabas Binney of Boston. She was possessed of superior powers of mind and was well versed in books and useful learning. And anybody who reads Jane Austen novels knows how this worked, that the house, the mansion house, went to the eldest son. The executors of Nicholas Brown's estate thought they would like to create a special house, a separate house that Avis could have for herself. And so they bought Seril Dodge's first house, the wooden house, and started to refit it for Avis. Now, it was completely finished by the time Seril Dodge sold it in 1791, but in the probate documents that one reads now, that they said they're going to create a house for Widow Brown after it is handsomely papered and finished. And by that, they mean that they're going to go inside and turn it from a ordinary interior into something quite special, befitting the widow of one of the merchant princes of Providence. Seril Dodge's wooden house was the sort of thing people built on Benefit Street and then newly over on the Weybosset side in the decades following the Revolutionary War. It had 2 rooms in the front and 2 rooms in the back, and it was 2.5 stories high. It was not an ordinary house, but it was not the finest houses in town. And the executors believed that, befitting the widow of Nicholas Brown, this really needed to be more special. And so when they said after handsomely papered and finished, they had in mind something that looked like this. Finish, in carpenter's parlance in 18th century Providence, means the decorative woodwork that goes around the inside of the house. It is not structural, it's purely decorative. And so here in the interior of Seril Dodge's wooden house, we see a very complex cornice at the top of the wall, and the casing that surrounds the doorway is made up of multiple moldings. And then a dado, or a panel at the bottom of the wall that protects the wallpaper from people banging their chairs into it. Do you see the modillion blocks and the dentils on this cornice? This isn't necessary to make the house work. It is just necessary to impress visitors and to reflect the dignity and the eminence of the Brown family. And so too with these, what you might call those ears sticking out on the top of the door casings. And at the dado, at the wainscoting at the bottom, look at that Vitruvian molding, those scrolls that run around the wall. And then at the very bottom, on top of the baseboard, is wonderful Chinese Chippendale carving. All of this was installed for Avis before she was able to move into the house. Out in the hallway, a whole different program of moldings on that baseboard, a Greek key rolling along the bottom. Going up the stairs to the second floor with these wonderful rococo ornaments for no particular reason other that it dresses up the house in the way that the widow of Nicholas Brown should live. The pièce de résistance of these parlors in the front were two great big mantelpieces. You can see up above the brickwork, there's a mantel shelf for you to put your decorative objects and leave things, books, but then there's a whole second story above that, entirely unnecessary and entirely delightful. This is not an enormous room, just 14 or 15 feet square. And so all this woodwork in here really overpowers the more ordinary size of this modest room. The idea for this elaborate mantelpiece came from a book published by William Salmon in London in 1738, Palladio Londinensis, or The London Art of Building. And the very best houses in town had these two-story fireplaces. Nicholas Brown's house had this. His brother John Brown's house, built in 1785, has two-story fireplaces. Joseph Brown's house, still standing on Main Street, has two-story fireplaces. The very closest one to Thomas Street was a house owned by Nathaniel Russell, just north of Thomas Street on Main Street. It still stands. The neighborhood had changed by the 1920s, and it was no longer a fashionable residential neighborhood. And so in 1920, this woodwork, the windows and the mantelpiece, were removed and sold to the Brooklyn Museum, where they were reinstalled in a period setting. So the photograph you see here of the Providence woodwork with this great mantelpiece is currently in Brooklyn, in the Brooklyn Museum. But you get the idea of how much this served as a model for the room that the executors of Nicholas Brown's estate wanted to provide for Avis. When Avis died in 1807, the Providence tax collectors made an inventory of her taxable property, the same way they did with anyone else in Providence who had anything worth taxing. And in this inventory, here are the Providence probate records in City Hall. They listed the objects that she owned and their value in dollars, and they named the places in which they found them. So here in the southeast parlor is a sofa and a mahogany lolling chair and straw-bottomed chairs and a pianoforte and stool and a mahogany Pembroke table and a looking glass and a bookcase. Then we go into books. There's elements of history and sacred geography. So you get a sense that in the uphill room, in the southeast parlor, people were sitting in chairs and listening at the piano and reading books and talking about books. And then across the hall in the southwest parlor, there's a table and a sofa, but there's a sideboard. There's dining chairs. And as we go down, there's a bread basket and tumblers and water goblets and glasses and knives and forks. And then there's a lot of silver. There's tablespoons and tea and salt spoons and a cream pot. Very different things in the Southwest parlor. In 1807, there was no such thing as a special dining room. But here we see what's happening in the Southwest parlor. People are doing a lot of eating and drinking. Her obituary describes a place where young women from town came to talk about things, to read books, to have a salon of interesting conversation. Sounds like a great feminist salon she was maintaining there in the house. After her death, the Brown family continued to own the Wood House for another century and used it as lodging for single relatives, for people who were visiting until 1906. We often say that neglect is one of the great friends of historic preservation. Nobody had a reason to put a lot of money into the house, to rip out those parlors and put in something more modern. So this is what the house looked like for all those years. It was a okay place to live. It was close to the Baptist church that figured so closely in the Brown family's lives. You'll remember that in the 1880s, the art club acquired the brick house, Seril Dodge's brick house up the hill. And when it turned it into a gallery upstairs, then built a monitor roof to flood the gallery with light. And so the brick house and the wood house, both built by Seril Dodge, were good neighbors for that next century. In 1906, the Providence and New Haven and Hartford Railroad decided to cut a train tunnel through College Hill. And so the trains could go straight through over to East Providence and then down to Barrington and Warren and Bristol and Newport, instead of having to go all the way up to Pawtucket to cross the river. And so this is what our backyard looked like. All the gardens and stables that were out back of the art club buildings got torn up and a tunnel got cut through. Here you see the date mark on the tunnel is 1908. That's when that abutment was finally built. In order to accommodate all this construction, the city of Providence condemned and took by eminent domain all the houses facing on Thomas Street. You can see here from the soot marks on the bridge abutment and all the trains going in and out that it really changed the neighborhood. It was dirty, it was loud, trains going through at all times of the day and night. So the real estate was much devalued. When they were through with their work, the railroad sold the wooden house to a grocer named Sidney Adams and gave the brick house to the Providence Art Club. Sidney Adams bought the wooden house so that he could establish a grocery store there. It's often the case that when someone wants to put a commercial operation into an old house, that they will just rip out the ground floor. But that's not what Sidney Adams did. He arranged to have the entire building jacked up in the air 15 feet so that he could live upstairs and run his grocery store downstairs, thereby saving all of that original woodwork that we so admired on the ground floor, now the second floor of the house. In the 1930s, one of the federal government programs to put people to work was designed for architects and architectural historians and draftsmen and photographers to record the architectural heritage of early America. And one of the first states to be investigated and recorded by the Historic American Building Survey was Rhode Island. And one of the first cities was Providence. And one of the first buildings was the Seril Dodge Avis Brown House on Thomas Street. So what we see here is a contact print from a negative that says Prov 13-1 and 3-7. That's how we identify these buildings. The Historic American Building Survey was making measured drawings and recording the house. And by now you see that the art club has acquired the house, and the Adamses have moved out in 1919, and we have built a bridge across, a brick bridge across from the brick house so that we can get into the art club's newly acquired wooden house next door. The Historic American Building Survey did extensive photographs of the interior of this building. Here we have the stair stringers with that wonderful Rococo ornament. Even after the Adams family sold the wooden house to the art club in 1919, they continued to maintain their store. So here we have in the photograph made by the Historic American Building Survey a sign that says Adams Groceries Market. And after the Adams grocery store closed, the art club rented the ground floor to the metal craft supply business that supplied metal for people making decorative metalwork, as you see in the illustration here. And after that, you see the sign out front for Oaks on the Hill. Before the Rhode Island School of Design had its own art supply store, Oaks on the Hill served the art community of Providence, selling paint and canvas and brushes. And Oaks on the Hill remained there until 1980, when we started to rebuild the foundation for this house. It was in dire structural condition. And so Oaks on the Hill moved out, and we turned it into a gallery after several years of repairing that ground floor shop. But we ran out of money, the art club did, and we didn't have enough funds at that point to do anything about the second floor, which was beginning to look a little tatty. And we used it for meetings, but more and more for storing artwork. The ceilings were in tough shape. We took them down in order to be in compliance with the City of Providence building codes. We had to put in sprinkler systems that didn't do much for the view of that cornice. And then you can see the fire alarm has got wires running to it. Nobody bothered to fish them up over the top of the ceiling. In the northeast room, the back of the house, that later was turned into a library, the wallpaper is peeling here and the plaster is coming down. We really had not yet raised the funds to restore the house to productive use. Upstairs, along the front of the house, and a scene that's hard to imagine now, was a studio. We knocked out the partitions and created one long room, the entire width of the house. You can see from the fluorescent lights here how it was illuminated. This subsequently was divided into two rooms in a central hallway, but it was where we held classes in the art club from the 1950s onward. When the house was raised, the chimneys were removed, and the last of the Brown family said, before we go, we would like to take these two special mantelpieces with us. And off they went with the family of John Carter Brown Washburn to East Greenwich, to their new house, and were reinstalled. So when you look at the Historic American Building Survey report, you can see these fireplaces illustrated. But the drawing is accompanied by a note that said that the delineator, the architectural draftsman, had to drive down to East Greenwich to draw the fireplaces because they were no longer in the house. It was about this time that the Ladies' Committee, and yes, there was a Ladies' Committee until the 1980s at the Art Club, took it upon themselves to raise the money, to raise the awareness of these rooms as architectural treasures, and so started a campaign in 1985 to have these rooms restored to their glory. Over the years, there have been a number of coats of paint here. Do you see how the molding on the right-hand side has the paint removed? It's the same molding as the molding on the left, and that's what it looked like. Things were looking a little worse for the wear as the molding disappeared, as the plaster cracked. And so the Ladies' Committee held a series of talks about historic houses, how this house could be repaired and improved and used again for parlors. So finally, the board, under the leadership of President Ray Altmoody and President Carl Johnson, and then later under President Dan Mechnick, decided to spend the money to get the houses fixed up. The great Chinese Chippendale fretwork that looked like this ended up looking like this. It was time to fix things up. So in order to ameliorate the scene that we see here with the filthy woodwork and the ripped wallpaper, with the ceilings that were falling down, we started out by pulling down all the ceilings, the plaster and then the lath and behind there, so that we could get new wiring and new heat up above those ceilings so it wouldn't intrude in the room. Put the sprinkler systems up there so they wouldn't intrude into many coats of paint. Here is a paint chronology that starts out, goes to a primer coat, then a grayish coat, then another darker coat, then a white coat, then a blue coat, then a white coat. Max Mays, the legendary raconteur, told me that in the 1950s, the ladies' committee thought that it would be a great thing to do to paint the rooms Delft blue. And one weekend came in and painted the entire room. So when the guys came in on Monday morning, they found a miniature Williamsburg appearance in the Dodge House. The guys in those years, the board did not suffer women members easily. And so the next weekend, they went out and bought their own paint and painted the brand new Delft blue white secretly over the weekend. So when the ladies came back 2 weeks later, all their work was gone. So that's a story of the 1950s at the art club, but here we see it writ large on the woodwork. We engaged Sarah Chase at the historic New England, then called the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, to actually determine what the color of this original paint was. The colors you see here have all been scraped down to a dirty, bleached out palette. These are not the colors that were chosen in the 18th century. These are what happened to the colors after 200 years. So Sarah went in and found little nuggets of paint that hadn't been exposed to the air or to the coal smoke, and came up with a painting scheme that would replicate accurately what was really there in the 1790s. Here's Sarah's mark on the wall. This is section number 6, and we can see a little bit of olive green paint there. It's a much deeper olive. This is going to have its paint stripped from it and painted brand new with historically accurate colors. Here's my student, Sergei Hasegawa from the Rhode Island School of Design. Sergei would come over during off times between classes and strip 200 years of paint from this overpainted woodwork. And when he was finished, the stair rail that would go up to the second floor be covered with paint solvent and a protective finish to keep it moist, and come back 3 or 4 days later and pull everything off. And this is what it looks like now. Just transformed the woodwork, transformed the house. As for the handsomely papered part of the decorative scheme, we went to Waterhouse Wall Hangings in Boston and asked them what would be appropriate for a house in Providence in the 1790s. And they suggested several papers, some of which they actually donated, but this was one that takes up the entire front hall as a paper that a merchant prince might have had in a house of this size in 1791. The Vitruvian scroll woodwork, the overpainted moldings in the front hallway, all got stripped by Sergei and some of his friends who came over. The very impressive staircase with those lovingly turned balusters were pretty dirty and pretty gloppy with paint. And so when they were stripped, they looked like this. All those lines so crisp now again. People said to us, well, why did you replace those balusters? That was the original fabric of the house. And we said, we didn't touch a thing. They're still there. That's what they looked like underneath. The great surprise was when we stripped the Rococo ornament on the stair stringers and found out that it wasn't carved wood. It was very soft metal, probably pewter. This seems to have been done after Seril Dodge sold the house to the Brown family executors. So we don't know if they were made by Seril Dodge, but as I say, it's a whole neighborhood of craftspeople and metalsmiths. So it seems probable that someone locally made this to fit these stairs. The big outstanding question is, what will we do about the glorious 2-story mantelpieces that had been removed in 1906 when the Brown family sold the house? In September of 1985, I went down and paid a call on Mrs. John Carter Brown Washburn, then advanced in years, and we talked about these mantelpieces. And I said, ideally, we would love to have them for the house if you ever get tired of them. Failing that, I wonder if we could come and make drawings of them and reproduce them. And she said, well, of course. She said, you know, when I'm through with them, you can have them. And by which I took to mean that they would go into her will, and we would be able to remove them from the house in East Greenwich and return them to their original site on Thomas Street. And when she died in 1990, we did not see that in the will, but Dan Mechnik, then president, recalls that he sat down with her son and reminded him how much these meant to us. And Kenneth Washburn said, sure, just all you have to do is replace them with something decent looking. And so we went down and removed the mantelpieces from the Washburns' house, repaired their wall and gave them a new mantelpiece for it. And here we have Bob Mendy's crew, Joe Gauch and his helper, bringing the mantelpieces back to the art club. And here you see the historic paint colors as discovered by Sarah Chase. Now, I would like to point out that in each room, we have left a complete column from floor to ceiling of paint that was not stripped. So if you go into the blue parlor here and look at that column, that post in the corner, you will see that the old paint survives on it. It's still got 6 or 8 coats of paint. And we did this so that 100 years from now, when somebody comes along and says, I wonder if those are accurate paint colors, they don't have to take our word. They can do their own analysis with whatever miracle technology will be available to us a century from now. Well, here we are out back of the Seril Dodge house with that fire trap staircase going down into the gallery below. By now, the grocery store is gone. The Metalcraft Supply is gone. Oaks on the Hill is gone. And we're using the downstairs as a classroom with a warning from the fire chief never to use this staircase. With skylights, you can see illuminating the room down below. And this is where we've built our most recent addition. And there are the 5 windows still in place. But you see now the hallway between the old Seril Dodge house, which is we've respected and left in its original condition. And down below, no more grocery store. Here's the gallery as we know today. And upstairs, we divided the space back up into its original 2 rooms above the 2 parlors. And so it looks like this today. The room that the probate tax officers of the city of Providence in 1807 called a kitchen didn't really have a great function other than storage in recent times. But you see the Deacon Taylor house out the window. It's just 3 feet away. The art club acquired this in 1962 and used it for rental properties for many years. But now that it is occupied for studios by the art club members, we found that it would be useful to have better access from the Dodge house. And so we cut a doorway through from one building to the other. As you can see on this bridge, just to the left of the Dodge house, you see a 3-foot wide bridge taking us over to the studios in the house next door. So that's the story of the last 235 years of the Seril Dodge wooden house. And so this is the way the building looks today. And this is the way Thomas Street looks today. It's still one of the most admired streets in Providence, one of the most admired streets in Rhode Island, one of the most admired streets in New England.